So Biden has just dropped out of the presidential run, as I'm sure you're all aware of. However, one of the interesting facts about this is the desperation for a long time with which the Democratic Party clung to the purely symbolic identity of Biden, uh, not the physical presence of Biden as a clearly aging man, but as the intention which they saw in Biden, which was to, in their eyes, to fix the mess left behind by the Trump administration. This disparity between Biden as an ideal for the Democratic Party and the actual Biden himself, this alienation of Biden towards himself, is precisely what Laplanche means by the Copernican revolution. The Copernican revolution of psychoanalysis is that moment in which identity is in a disparity towards itself. Freud wrote that there were three blows to mankind's narcissism. Firstly, Copernicus himself. Copernicus wrote, Copernicus's intervention was that we are not the center of the universe. The second blow to mankind's narcissism, according to Freud, was Darwin. With Darwin, we were forced to recognize that we do not occupy a privileged, transcendental, or divinely posited relation to nature, but that we are one of many products of a evolutionary progress. Now, the third blow, Freud writes, is himself, the unconscious. With the dawn of the recognition of the unconscious comes the fact that we are not the central agents of our own subjectivity. The ego, as Freud writes, is not master of its own house. It's not that you have some I, some Cartesian cogito, that is at the center of a self-positing world that then looks outwards. It's that the I is in itself in disparity towards itself. Now, for Laplanche, Jean Laplanche was a student, first of all, of Jacques Lacan. His background was in medicine. It was also in philosophy. He was taught by Merleau-Ponty, the contemporary of Jean-Paul Sartre. And his project, in part, was to reconcile the intervention of psychoanalysis with the presuppositions, the pre-established knowledge of philosophy. He considered himself, whilst a clinician, as he said, he considered himself first and foremost a theorist. Now, the Copernican revolution of psychoanalysis, the decentering that psychoanalysis effectuates, was for Laplanche the recognition of the intimacy of otherness. The ground of the self, of the subject, isn't the Cartesian I, a stable, self-identical, transparent reference point, but otherness itself, the impersonal, inarticulable, irreconcilable, vague presence, the zone of incomprehensible knowledge that the other formulates. This is for Sartre where the self lies. It's not that you have the self, the subject, and then other people. It's that the condition of subjecthood is the existence of otherness in its impersonal, inarticulable, traumatic form. Now, in this way, what Laplanche engages with, although he doesn't explicitly say this, which is always, in my opinion, very strange, but it's a vindication of Jean-Paul Sartre, of Sartre's ontology that he presents in Being and Nothingness. For Sartre, the relation of the subject to itself is the relation of the subject to the other. There is no moment in which the subject has a total transparent knowledge of itself and then recognizes the existence of others. It's that otherness as an impersonal, abstracted moment is the ground for a subjective agent. This is what Sartre means by being for others. He uses a very wonderful, and we'll get onto this properly, but he uses a very wonderful example in which the existence of otherness, its conceptual moment in the existence of the subject, constructs and formulates the way the subject articulates itself. In other words, it's not that the subject precedes otherness, it's that the otherness is the ground for a subject. He uses the example of, imagine yourself looking through a keyhole into a locked room. In this, you engage in some espionage into the room. You look into the room and you whatever, you're looking at the other side of the door, whatever it is. In this moment, consciousness is unthetic. It is simply its own act of espionage. You are your own act of looking in through the keyhole and seeing what is on the other side. Now, imagine, Sartre says, imagine a moment in which you, for some reason, either you imagine you hear footsteps coming down the corridor in which you're stood looking into the keyhole, or imagine that you simply, spontaneously conceive of someone watching you. At this moment, you don't have this immediate sense of identity with your own act. You're suddenly reframed in relation to what it is that you're doing. It's not simply that you, to some extent, can identify fully with your act. It's that you now recognize that your act in itself, from an external perspective, has a certain symbolic meaning where you reflect on the fact that you are not entirely your act, but you observe your act from the perspective of another, from the perspective of this hypothetical otherness through which you see yourself. In this moment, it's not merely that in this moment you cannot anymore reconcile your act to your identity. Your identity itself enters into a disparity in which otherness becomes constitutive of how you see yourself. Through the possible existence of the other, you are framed as a certain agent which sees itself in disparity towards itself. Being for the other, or being for otherness, in other words, is a moment in which the I, the subject, recognizes that the ground of articulating itself fully is a disparity which is introduced by the existence of the other. Now, this, we return to Laplanche. This is the internal alienation of the self from itself. It's l'étrangeté intérieure, as Laplanche would call it. The étrangeté intérieure can be translated in different ways. It means perhaps its most faithful translation would be something like internal alienness, an internal foreignness. It also generally is understood as something like radical alterity in the general post-structuralist tradition of recognizing a inarticulable kernel of foreign alienation as central to yourself. As it's not that you have the obscure existence of the other externally, it's that the other is so obscure and external that it is a moment lodged within your relation to yourself. It is an internal foreignness. Now, how does this work? How is the irreconcilable exteriority of otherness lodged within the essence of subjecthood itself? What is this constitutive presupposition of otherness? For Laplanche, this is with the help of language, with the help of what he calls a generalized seduction, and with the help of the enigmatic signifier. So, ultimately, Laplanche argues that no act, and he takes on a very faithful Freudian approach, no act is entirely identical to itself. No act is self-identical, in other words, that with every utterance, with every idea, with every wish, with every behavior, there is an element, a certain ground, a certain intention to that act that you cannot yourself fully account for. There is a kernel of your own agency that seems to escape the reason you attribute to it. For every conscious intention you have for an action, there is a simultaneous obverse. There is the simultaneous fact that something escapes your capacity to articulate the reason for which you're doing it. Your behaviors are not transparent to yourself. The ground for your utterances and for your ideas are always nested in part in something that cannot be completely understood. Now, he says this is the universal fact that Freud discovers. This is whatever disagreement you might have about the existence of the unconscious, it is at least this. It is at least the fact that you are not the rational, self-determining Cartesian agent that we were thought to be prior to Freud's intervention. Now, at a certain point, Laplanche argues, we are exposed to care, love, affection, whatever it is, by an adult, by a caretaker. Now, the adult's actions towards the child, by implication, have a moment within themselves which are beyond, which transcend or exceed the standard caretaking intention that they embody. Now, the Freudian fact is that the unconscious, the color of everyday life that the unconscious introduces, is a sexual color. Sexuality is not one part of other aspects of human behavior. Sexuality colors the whole of human engagements and human projects. The moment human sexuality is something that is achieved, it retroactively posits itself as a moment within everyday relations. Now, this kernel of unconscious sexuality is something that is expressed in the most simple of actions, gestures, and utterances. It is also something that cannot be, as Laplanche says, metabolized, digested, articulated, reflected upon by the infant. So at a certain moment, the parent's sexuality unconsciously makes itself present as a signifier or as a message that the child cannot fully understand. When this happens, this message, this signifier that carries an obverse of a certain sexual formation that makes no sense, that is simply inconceivable to the child, it simply lodges itself as something that is, as Laplanche says, à traduire, to be translated. It simply is something that cannot be translated. The messages, the standard gestures of the parent, whether it is feeding, whether it is changing clothes, whether it is washing, are to some extent articulable or thinkable to the child. However, the kernel of otherness, of the parent's own aspect of radical alterity, is something that the child cannot conceive of. Now, this absolute opaque moment of otherness for Laplanche is sexuality. The sexuality that lies underneath and colors every standard common gesture. So, this enigmatic signifier that is given by the parent to the child, accidentally, unintentionally, carries within itself the essence of their own unconscious, in other words, the essence of their own impersonal otherness. This otherness is impossible to comprehend, to subjectively fit into a preconceived language, into a preconceived set of coordinates or representative system. It cannot be consciously understood, and it is in itself the first point of repression. Now, for Laplanche, you don't have a subject that then represses. It's that this repression of something that cannot in the first place be uttered in itself creates a subject. It is that you don't have a subject that then represses. Repression formulates the coordinates for a subject. In the same way that for Hegel, it's not that the fall from paradise, let's say, it's not that you have the human register, the human order, and then it fell from the undifferentiated goodness of paradise. It's that the fall itself constitutes the thing that fell. The fall itself posits the human register that fell. It's that a negative moment, a loss, a lack, precedes what it is that was lost, what it is that is lacking. The negative moment retroactively constitutes the thing that has been negated. For Hegel, the loss precedes what is lost. For Laplanche, repression precedes the repressing subject. It's that you have the sudden experience of something that you cannot articulate, and this immediate repression of this alterity formulates a subject of this repressed alterity. In this sense, the ground for a subject for Laplanche is the presupposition of otherness. A subject only exists once the openness, the irreconcilable aspect of otherness itself is posited. The essence, in this sense, of a subject is the fact that an aspect of it cannot be articulated to itself, but constitutively depends on the existence of otherness in its conceptual radical dimension. Now again, we return to Hegel, because this is precisely what Hegel means by for-andere sein in German, the term being for the other, or being for otherness. Essence in this sense, for Hegel, essence inscribes in itself the irreconcilable tension between what it is and what it appears as to an observer. The concrete existence of something, Hegel writes in his Logic, is possible only insofar as it appears to another, to a moment of registration. A thing, an essence, is only an essence once it appears. For Hegel, in fact, this is why essence isn't something that you separate from appearance. It's that appearance is a function of essence. In fact, essence is only possible when you have appearance. When something appears to something, the essence of that thing shows that what that thing is only insofar as it appears to an observer. Now, I mean, this is why you have the trend quite recently of trying to reconcile Hegel with some of the more obscene aspects of quantum physics. For example, a quantum state with whatever x degrees of freedom becomes itself the way in which it is registered. The alignment of a certain measurement device to a quantum state will in itself determine the probability of that quantum state appearing in a certain measurement. It is as if the quantum state, in its essence, presupposes how it appears to an external moment. In other words, essence for Hegel, or a quantum state, is constitutively, internally, ontologically open to interpretation. It inscribes within itself that moment where it is interpreted somewhere else. It's not that you have a stable essence and then something comes to, look at it. It's that the act of observing, of looking, of registering, in itself constructs the thing that is observed. The thing observed presupposes the way that it comes to be understood. It only exists once it is recognized in the eye of something external to itself. Now, what this means is that otherness, the external moment that in itself can't be articulated for this moment, this otherness seems to be internal to the presuppositions of that thing itself. Essence for Hegel presupposes, internally, it presupposes that which it cannot articulate. It presupposes an external moment of registration as internally constitutive of itself. Absolute exteriority, in this sense, is internal to the thing. This is Laplanche's étrangeté intérieure. It's that the absolute radical alterity of an external, exterior moment of otherness is lodged, is inscribed as internal to the subject itself. When you strip away the layers, when you look at the basic ground for my selfhood, for myself as a subject, for the I, you don't find the I as an absolutely self-identical moment. What you find is that the I is discrepant, open to interpretation, that it presupposes an external moment of otherness. Now, for Laplanche, the subject is, precisely in the Sartrean sense, it is its own being for the other. It exists only insofar as internal to itself is the fact that it recognizes itself as posited by its appearance to another. Now, this is why, for psychoanalysis, the key to subjecthood is the alienation of subjecthood from itself. It's the fact that the subject is something that is not reconcilable to its own identity. The paradox here is clear. The standard original rationalist Cartesian approach was something along the lines that we have a stable, determined selfhood, an I, and then you have the external world that you can or cannot doubt. It might be your own sort of speculative capacity to deduce whether or not it exists. No. Exteriority in itself, otherness, is internal to the subject. The subject is only itself insofar as it cannot be reconciled to its own identity. It is a relation of non-identity to itself. It presupposes an openness, an otherness that it cannot itself articulate. This is the enigmatic signifier. This is the à traduire, the yet to be translated of Laplanche. For Laplanche, the central moment of subjecthood is something that is radically foreign to the subject itself. With this, for Laplanche, we can understand trauma. I mean, trauma is in fact one of the great interventions that Laplanche has. Trauma isn't simply the standard clinical understanding for Laplanche. It's not that something happens and you find it so horrific that once it's made sense, that once it's in front of you, you reject it, you can't understand it. It's that trauma is so foreign that it's nothing. The traumatic event is something that almost slips under the surface. Whatever it is that produces a traumatic reaction, it is never the event itself, it is the subsequent failed reintegration of that event into your own subjective coordinate system. A trauma, in other words, as Laplanche says, is a trauma that always happens twice. In order for trauma to be constituted, the same event must happen twice. Once externally, and again internally. This is what Laplanche means by a category that he spent a lot of time trying to understand, which is in German Nachträglichkeit, in French après coup, which has had a lot of difficult translations in English. Initially, it was translated as deferred action, until Laplanche retranslated it as afterwardsness. When you have a traumatic experience, what you're having is the lack of an experience. You're suddenly experiencing a break, a rupture in the fluid continuity of your everyday subjective understanding of the world. Suddenly something appears to you that cannot be assimilated to how you articulate the world, but simply lodges itself as an alien otherness, as something that is an empty kernel of failed understanding, of failed articulation. Now, this formal emptiness is simply, Laplanche says, carried. It is simply something that lodges itself internal to subjecthood and is only at a certain later point retroactively filled in. Sexuality is precisely this. It's not that at some point you're exposed to the existence of a sexual relation, of sexual difference, and then you slowly assimilate it and understand it. It's that the first experience of sexual difference, of this absolute irreconcilable existence of the other that determines your own relation to yourself, is such a untranslatable rupture that it only retroactively fills itself with a certain meaning by your capacity to speculate on nothing. What happens with trauma is it installs a moment of nothingness, an empty formality that is later on retroactively speculated upon, fantasized, and filled in by a more mature yet deviating understanding. Nothingness is once again where Laplanche returns to Sartre. For Sartre, nothingness is the moment in which you move from being in itself. Now, being in itself for Sartre is simple phenomenal identity. This table, for example, of a table of an object which has a certain phenomenal value to my apperception of an object, we can say that this object is what it is. It is internally in complete relation to the way that it appears. The move from this being in itself to being for itself is the move from objecthood to conscious being. Now, the disparity between the two is simply that the being for itself, the being of consciousness, as Sartre writes, is the being of something in which its own being is in question. It is the being that cannot be entirely reconciled with itself. The act of myself existing and the reflection by myself upon my own existence shows a clear, imperceptible, inarticulable discrepancy. Now, this discrepancy is what Sartre calls nothingness, because it is not one thing amongst other that I can then say, this is this gap between myself and myself. It is an ineradicable, permanent color of non-identity which consciousness introduces. The moment consciousness emerges on the scene, it negates itself. The moment consciousness arrives, it looks back upon its own ground and enters into a disparity with itself. It attempts to suspend itself according to its ability to think itself. Now, this moment of a gap, this moment of a rupture, but of an imperceptible, inarticulable, simple sliding of my identity away from itself, this nothingness is the à traduire that Laplanche speaks of. It is the moment of an empty, formless discrepancy in which selfhood recognizes within itself the interminable, permanent existence of radical alterity, of otherness. Now, this is a decentering par excellence. The standard view before this, before Sartre, even in psychoanalysis, before Laplanche, was that you have the center of agency, of subjecthood, that reaches out into the world and then recognizes the world as an external fact, and sometimes recedes back into itself, knowing that at least within itself it has a certain rational self-positing, a certain rational identity towards itself. For Laplanche, this is the first mistake. There is no such thing as a transparency towards yourself. There is no such thing as an I that is clear to itself. The innermost point of the subject is its own otherness, its own foreignness to itself. The I is a stranger in its own eyes. The self is something of a uncomfortable neighbor that you cannot posit as reconcilable to your own subjecthood. So what is the unconscious for Laplanche? For Freud, the often repeated model of the unconscious is its own site of agency that wishes, that wants things, that is antagonistic to consciousness or to the ego, and that must somehow, either via censorship mechanism or by some other means, be calmed, mediated, managed, etc. For Laplanche, the unconscious is more of a metaphysical color. The unconscious is simply a failed translation. The unconscious is the ineluctable moment of otherness that is lodged at the center of the I. The unconscious is something that simply persistently fails to be translated into my own language. In other words, the unconscious is where my knowledge of myself ends. It is where that moment of my own agency fails to account for itself. It is where I am no longer a clear, transparent subject to myself. So the unconscious, in this sense, is otherness. It is the moment of otherness that I find lodged as a presupposition for my own existence. Now, clinically, what this implies is it is not a question of finding what is the true unconscious wish for Laplanche. For Laplanche, there is no true ultimate unconscious formation. What you find at the ground of the subject, at the unconscious substrate of subjectivity, is a persistent failure for there to be any meaning. It is a constant sliding of any stable meaning away from itself. The task, therefore, is not to eventually posit the true wish of the subject, but to recognize that there is no true wish. There is no stable unconscious formation. There is only the failure of the unconscious to actually wish anything. The unconscious is simply a failed translation. It is a failed ability of subjecthood to be entirely transparent to itself. It is the moment of a unrepresentable, inexplicable, radical alterity that lies at the ground of my own incomplete relation to myself. In this sense, the I, subjecthood, is something extremely incomplete. Whatever the subject is, it is something that is obscured from its own understanding. It is an incompleteness that lies in the openness of the subject to what is inexpressible for it, otherness. Radical alterity, this étrangeté intérieure, this internal foreignness, this is the ground of subjectivity. This is a important decentering. It's an important lesson that even many psychoanalysts aren't taking seriously. Often you hear things like, tell me about how you truly feel today. Laplanche's insistence is that this how do you truly feel, doesn't exist, because you cannot reflect upon your own identity without encountering the otherness that lies at the ground of your identity. You cannot reflect on yourself without encountering the fact that you are not truly yourself. You are always the sliding away from yourself that is marked by a radical alterity.